We're going to be discussing the moral concept. We're going to be discussing what we think the nature of morality is, assuming morality exists. Morality may not exist. There may not be anything that's right and wrong to do. Santa Claus doesn't exist either, but we have a concept of Santa Claus, right? You could tell me about Santa Claus for quite a while and tell me about his, his clothes, what he does on New Year's Eve, and so where he lives. You know a lot of things about Santa Claus, as it were. Well, you know things about the Santa concept. And that doesn't mean, though, that you know anything about Santa Claus himself, because Santa Claus doesn't exist. Okay, so what we're talking about is the moral concept. It may not be that every philosopher will agree with some things I have to say about the nature of morality, but nonetheless, this is a fairly mainstream take on the nature of morality. So without further ado, let's jump in. Ethics is a word with many meanings. One meaning is the systematic study of morality. So what is morality? Well, I'm going to understand morality as the necessary and universal limits of rational action. And I'm going to spend most of the rest of this presentation unpacking that analysis. Let's first talk about action. Morality concerns first and foremost actions. To some extent, ethics is concerned about what makes a person good or bad, or a life good or bad. But these concerns are secondary to ethics' main concern, which is right and wrong action. Now, in intellectual circles, sometimes this point will be expressed as saying morality is practical in the sense of being about action, okay, and not theoretical, or in the sense of being about representing the world as it is. Now we're going to talk about limits. What do I mean by limits? Second, morality is about the rightness and wrongness, goodness and badness of the limits of what we can do. Simply put, ethical constraints trump all other constraints, just like even a 2 of spades will trump an ace of hearts in the game of spades, because spades is the trumping suit. So ethical constraints trump all other constraints, aims, or reasons you may have. If it really is wrong for you to do X, then you must not do X. Here's a way of seeing what we mean. Nutrition, and as the field of study, is interested in what we should eat, in what it would be good for us to eat. More precisely yet, it would be nutrition is about what it would be good for us to eat, assuming we're interested in being healthy. Creative writing, the field of study, is interested in how to write fiction well. Notice that eating and writing are actions. So each of these fields aims at discovering the principles or rules that help describe the limits of something, in these cases, good creative writing or healthy eating. Now, these fields are not part of ethics, because ethics is concerned with actions you must not do, no matter what else you want to do, or how bad you want to do it, or what may be lost in your doing it. So obviously, sometimes it's okay to write bad fiction. And sometimes it's okay to eat food that's bad for you, say, if you're at a Super Bowl party. But the true ethical principles, assuming there are any, are never okay to break. So some action that really does break a true moral principle, or as we'll see, a true moral principle correctly applied, is an action that you must not do, no matter what else you want, or how bad you want it, or what other costs may be. Now, of course, you can physically do something that's morally wrong. You and I do morally wrong things all the time. But unlike good eating or good fiction writing, morality is the sort of thing whose principles we must always try to obey. That's its nature. Now, some people think that nothing can have this nature. Maybe they're right. And if so, morality doesn't exist. But if morality exists, then it is such that it is what philosophers call inescapable. If morality exists, we cannot run from morality's authority over us. Now, what does it mean to say that morality exists? This requires us to note the difference between things and the qualities of things, which we'll call properties. Consider a blue wooden building block. This block is a thing. It has properties or qualities or features. It is blue. It is made of wood. It is a building block. It weighs 1 ounce, and so on. Now, actions also have properties. Consider crossing the street. That is an action. It has various properties or features, like you can cross briskly, you can cross illegally, you could cross haphazardly, or so forth. Now, when philosophers say that morality, quote unquote, exists, all we mean by that is to say that actions also have the property of being right or wrong, good or bad. So, for example, to say adult child sex is wrong, to say that is merely to assert that pedophilia has the property of being morally wrong. Okay, so pedophilia, a type of action, would have this property of being morally wrong. Let's talk about principles. So just as nutrition professors research and aspire to teach about the limits of nutritious eating, ethicists research and aspire to teach about the limits of morally permissible action. Whether in nutrition, or let's say we're coaching basketball, or in ethics or whatever, we teach these limits in terms of rules. So if we're teaching a cooking class, we may say, we'll keep stirring scrambled eggs when, under medium heat or something like that. Or if you're coaching somebody in basketball, you say, well, shoot like this, hold the basketball at the tips of your fingers and so forth. Now, these quote unquote rules are not, I think, best thought of as commands. They are rules in the sense of principles. If this principle is correct, then following it perfectly will leave you doing only good things and not bad things. So just as following a nutritionist's quote unquote rules, really principles of nutritious eating, will leave you eating only good things and not bad things. So it isn't as if the nutritionist makes the rules, right? It's not like the nutritionist commanding the rules into existence of good eating. All right, so the nutritionist is merely discovering those rules or principles. Likewise, ethicists are not making up the moral rules. We are merely discovering or trying to discover these rules or principles. And we can be wrong. And so can nutritionists. And obviously, we don't always agree. Ethicists don't agree on lots of things, but neither do nutritionists. But we still hope that there is some fact of the matter about what is nutritious eating, and likewise, we're going to assume there is some fact of the matter about what is right and wrong action. Now, things aren't, though, as simple as even this. If you've ever taught anything in your life, you know that you teach rules that generally work, but don't always work. Sure, you generally should shoot like this, but Steph Curry should sometimes not shoot in that way, say when being double teamed as the buzzer about to go off in a tied game. So rules almost always have exceptions. And there are at least 2 ways an otherwise good principle could have an exception. So some principles are true, what we're going to call ceteris paribus. We will say that a ceteris paribus principle is one that has exceptions in circumstances that we're not assuming or ignoring. So, for instance, you should do the Heimlich maneuver on people who are choking. That seems like a good principle. Do the Heimlich maneuver on people who are choking, or if someone's choking, perform the Heimlich maneuver on them. People aren't going to argue with you about that. They're going to say, yeah, that sounds right. But nonetheless, that rule is only true ceteris paribus, because you shouldn't do it on a baby who's choking. All right. Now, of course, we're assuming when we say, oh, if someone's choking, perform the Heimlich maneuver on them. When we say that, we're assuming we're not talking about babies. And that's why that principle sounds right. Even though this principle has exceptions, it is a good principle. Likewise, we may think that the principle don't kill people is a good principle, but obviously it has exceptions. We are not thinking about self-defense cases where you may need to kill somebody in self-defense, in which we think that is morally permissible. Unless you're a pacifist, you think killing people to defend your nation in war is morally permissible. If you think the death penalty is okay, you think it's okay to kill people. Okay, you don't have those in mind maybe when you endorse the principle don't kill, but that just means that you hold the principle to be true ceteris paribus. Now, some principles we sometimes are going to say are true prima facie, and by that we mean that they are true, but they can be outweighed. So whereas ceteris paribus exceptions mean they don't apply at all, true prima facie principles may be said to have their considerations outweighed. So for instance, prima facie, you shouldn't kill innocent people. But there may be situations that it is justified to kill an innocent person. So for instance, if some evil space aliens come to Earth and they credibly threaten to destroy Earth if we don't kill Jill, who's some innocent person, then maybe we should kill Jill. The badness of killing Jill, as it were, weighs against killing Jill. But nonetheless, the wrongness of killing Jill is outweighed by the wrongness of not saving Earth. So, it's just something that does go on the scales. It's not like it doesn't go on the scales like in the ceteris paribus case. A medical analogy might be that although chemotherapy drugs are toxic, and they're toxic even to people who have cancer, right? So they still present us with a reason not to give somebody chemotherapy, right? Even if they have cancer. Why? Because they're toxic. Nonetheless, right, the toxic the toxic chemicals in chemotherapy, as bad as they are even worse for the cancer. So it all told is good for you to take chemotherapy if you have cancer, right? So the harmfulness of the chemotherapy is outweighed by the benefit of it. Are there any exceptionalist moral principles? I'm not too sure there are. Lots of philosophers like the example of it's wrong to torture babies for fun, so consider that principle. Torturing babies for fun is wrong. And then it's really hard to find a counterexample to it. So that, be that as it may, there may not be a lot of these briefly put succinct, principles that are exceptionalists. Okay. And I hope that the chemotherapy example shows that even if you have a hard time coming up with principles that are exceptionalist, that doesn't mean there's like no fact of the matter. There is clearly a fact of the matter about what's good for the body and bad for the body, and what's good medicine and bad medicine. We're trying to learn more about it every day. And the fact that there are, few to no exceptionalist principles of good medicine doesn't mean that, medicine is hokum. And likewise, the fact that an ethicist can provide you with very few exceptionalist principles of ethics doesn't mean that ethics is hokum. Universality of morality concerns the fact that the way you think about morality, not me, you, the way you think about morality is such that you think that morality, that the same very general moral constraints apply to everybody, no matter where they live, no matter when they lived. Okay, now this may not seem precisely correct. You may think that, well, they had other ideas about what is right and wrong, and so we can't judge them for living by the moral standards that they thought was correct. Now that may be right, but notice you're applying this general rule that you can't morally condemn people for acting according to their conscience. Okay, and then you're thinking that there's this generally what we'll call morally relevant fact that they had different beliefs about what's right and wrong, and that morally relevant fact between us is different, and so that's why it's okay for them to act differently. But it's not that the morality is different, it's just that different morally relevant facts were in play in their case, right? So likewise, I think that the English, I think if you go to England, you should drive on the left side of the road, just as I think if you're in America, you should drive on the right. That isn't because I think that, you know, there's any moral difference between America and England. Okay, there's a morally relevant difference between us in that there's a different convention. In this case, an arbitrary convention, but nonetheless, conventions bring with them a certain sort of moral importance because they coordinate our behavior. Okay, so it's a morally relevant fact that they have a convention there that you drive on the left, and it's a morally relevant fact that we have a convention where you drive on the right. Okay, and that morally relevant fact gets plugged in to the more general moral rule, which is that you should comply with the local driving conventions so that everyone can move about in a safe and efficient way. Okay. We even think that morality extends beyond humans. We even think that morality extends to alien creatures if they're out there. Okay. Now, obviously, these creatures would have different natures, and that nature, the differences in our natures are sometimes morally relevant, such that when we plug it into more general moral principles, they should behave in different ways. So, for instance, if there's a race of intelligent eagles, it might be morally good for them to push their babies out of the nest when it's time for them to fly. You and I should not push our children off of high places, but that morally intelligent, that intelligent race of eagles should, right? Does that mean they have a different moral code? No, it just means that there's a morally relevant difference between us because we have different natures, right? Both of us are discharging our obligations to our children. What about the necessity of morality? Now, this requires us to talk about the difference between contingent facts and necessary facts. So a contingent fact is a fact that happens to be the case. And a necessary fact is a fact that couldn't not be the case. So it could have been the case, well, let's assume it could have been the case, that you wore a shirt with another color today. Most people think you could have worn a different colored shirt. That may not be true, but let's suppose it is. And it seems like if, you know, your parents didn't have that second glass of wine 20 years ago or whatever, that you would not have been born, maybe. Okay, and so our existence is contingent. Heck, even the entire earth might not have ever been formed, or, you know, let alone humans might not have been evolved, right? So all sorts of things are contingent. It's kind of amazing to think about. But there are some facts that seem to be facts that couldn't not have been facts, that couldn't not have been the case. So for instance, the Pythagorean theorem couldn't be false. Like, even if Pythagoras never existed, the Pythagorean theorem, what it's talking about would still be true. Or, you know, the idea, the fact that nothing could be all red and all green at the same time, or that two things and two things amount to four things. Those are facts that would have been facts no matter what. Okay. And this also seems like a necessary fact, that you shouldn't cause great suffering for no good reason. Okay. So that's a moral principle, though. So it seems like moral principles are also necessary truths. You know, so you know, even if humanity never evolved, it would seem like aliens living in Alpha Centauri would be wrong to torture other innocent, harmless members of their kind for fun. Okay, and you know, these moral truths, assuming there are any, are also necessary. Finally, morality, the constraints on our actions, the moral constraints on our actions, there must be some reason for them. Okay, and a famous example that helps prove this point comes from philosopher Philippa Foot. She said, you know, well, if she said basically this: if someone told you that you morally mustn't stare at hedgehogs in the moonlight, you know, the very thou shalt not stare at hedgehogs in the moonlight, you'd be pretty puzzled. You would try to figure out why it would be wrong to stare at hedgehogs in the moonlight. Right? I think you appreciate that. I mean, it's a real head scratcher. And you're not willing to accept that it is really wrong, in fact, to look at hedgehogs in the moonlight until you see some reason for it. Okay? And if you can't see any reason for yourself, and if they don't supply one, then you're just not going to believe them. Right? You're just going to doubt that it's wrong to look at hedgehogs in the moonlight, as you should, right? Because you have part of your moral concept, part of the moral concept that we share, is that moral constraints, assuming there are any, right, have to have some reason for them. They have to be reasonable.